I hope you guys are ready for week 2 of our missionary story about a man named Anthony Rossi. It's called A Little Rascal Who Became a Man of God. But before we get started, I know several of you watched our video for last week and you submitted your answers, and we randomly drew a name, and the winner of the $10 Chick-fil-A gift card from last week's lesson is going to go to Lydia Byer. So Lydia, congratulations, you are the winner. And this week, make sure you're paying attention. Watch the video, pay attention, and answer the questions that are submitted for this week. And next week, we'll have another drawing and we'll announce the winner next Sunday. Okay? So congratulations, Lydia. Let's quickly review last week's lesson. We are talking about a boy named Anthony or Tony, and he is known for being a rascal because he would get into mischief, if you remember. And last week in our lesson, the story starts with something called a terremoto. And if you answered your question correctly, there was a big, massive earthquake where over 80,000 people died. One of those was Ricardo, Anthony's older brother. And the Rossi family lost their home. They lost everything they had. They ended up going to live with an aunt. And Tony, he constantly got into trouble. He would skip school. You remember his dad gave him a 10 cents, I believe it was, to get him to go to school. And Tony was very quickly distracted by his friend Giovanni. And you remember where we ended off in our lesson last week. Giovanni and Tony were going on an adventure. They had stolen, they had broken into homes and stolen what they needed to go on their trip. And right as we ended, the boys heard some screaming behind them. They heard someone calling, "Tony, Tony, there he is, get him." And that's where we ended off. Well, today we're going to find out what happened to Tony and Giovanni. So the boys, let me make sure I'm where I need to be. So the boys ran as fast as they could, trying to get away from the people that they heard calling them, chasing them. Tony turned around and it was some of his brothers. And they grabbed him, drug him home, laid him in his bed, and they tied him to his bed. And they said, "Here, fine, now you can't get into any more mischief." And Tony was so upset, man, tied to his bed. His grandma came up and said, "Tony, you're grounded for 2 days, and you have to spend the entire 2 days in your bed." Well, I can think of some of you. Some of you come to my mind right now. Eli, you would struggle with that, wouldn't you? Another one, Lydia Knott. If you had to lay in bed for 2 whole days, I'm sure that would be so hard. And it was hard for Tony. He wanted to get up. He wanted to play. He wanted to go on adventures. But he was stuck for 2 days. Well, after 2 days, his grandmother came in and said to him, "All right, you're done. You're ungrounded. You may go play." Tony was so happy. He ran to his grandma, gave her a great big hug. And his grandma looked at him and said, "Why do you always get into trouble, my little rascal?" And he said, "I don't know. I always get into trouble." She said, "You need to go to school." He said, "I just don't have any friends at school." And she said, "Well, make friends." And as she's talking to him, Tony looked like he was paying attention, but in his mind, he was concocting a plan. So he went to his brother, Carlo, and he said, "Carlo, I have a plan that we can catch mice. I came up with a trap, and I think if we make this trap just right, we will be able to catch mice." Carlos said, I don't know, Tony. I'll believe that this trap will work when I see it, when we catch mice. So Tony said, okay, come on, let's build this trap. So what they did was they propped up a pot, and they took short piece of bamboo and they placed a hunk of cheese on one end. He said, this is the way to catch a mouse. He placed a pot upside down over the stick so the pot rested on the outside end of it. Inside the pot, he put the cheese. The rim of the pot balanced on the edge of the stick. So when a mouse came under there to eat the cheese, the pot would fall and they would trap the mouse. So the next morning, Tony woke up early and he went to check his trap. And he says, look, Carlo, we got something. He could hear squeaking and he could hear scratching coming from underneath the pan. And when he and Carlo lifted up the pot, they not only caught one mouse, they caught 2 mice. And they quickly snatched them up and they put them in a paper bag. So now Tony has a bag of 2 mice, and he says to Carlo, all right, I'm headed to school. You're going to school, Tony? Carlo couldn't believe it. Why would he want to go to school? He never wanted to go to school. And why would he want to go to school so early? But he did. He left for school. So Tony went to school before anyone was there. And he went to the teacher's desk and he slipped, quietly slipped the mice into the drawer of the teacher. And then he slipped out so no one knew what he was doing. So as Tony's at school, it was just a normal day. They started off reciting poems, and the teacher looked at Tony and says, all right, Anthony Rossi, I want you to repeat this poem for today. Tony stood up and he said, I'm sorry, I don't know the poem. Because, he skipped school. He hadn't been there. And she said, all right, have a seat. She called on somebody else, and they stood up and recited the poem. And then they sat down. And right away, Anthony raised his hand. He said, okay, I know the poem now. I'm ready to say it. And the teacher said, but you said you didn't know the poem. He said, well, I didn't, but I heard it one time and now I know it. The teacher was skeptical, but she said, all right, go ahead. And Anthony stood up and he recited the poem perfectly. The teacher was very impressed. She thought, wow, I'll be able to go and tell his parents something good about him for a change. She was excited. She wanted to tell them something good. So she sat down behind the desk and she opened her drawer, and 2 fuzzy mice sprang out and darted across the desk and landed right in her lap. That would be enough for Miss Jessica. I'd be done. I'd probably scream, jump on top of the desk, or run out the room. I don't like bugs. I don't like mice. I don't like anything that's small and alive, other than children. But here Anthony is getting into trouble. So all the kids screamed. Everybody was screaming and laughing and running. And Tony just sat at his desk with his little rascally grin on his face. And he thought it was just so funny. But he didn't think it was funny when he had to take a note home to his father telling what he had done. I am such a rascal, he thought. Papa has to punish me almost every day. So Tony, he has this reputation of getting into trouble. Everybody knows what he does. And as Tony started to get a little older, Tony realized that something was missing from his life. He didn't know what it was, but he felt something was missing. And so, let me get my picture out. Ever since several years ago, the time of the earthquake, ever since then, Tony had really started to wonder about God and about heaven. And so he went up to his grandma one day. He was watching her sit there holding her rosary, which is a necklace of beads. And she would touch one of the beads and she would say a prayer. And he wanted so badly to know about God. This is all he knew was what his grandma believed. And he said, Grandma, can I sit and think about God with you? She said, yes. And as Grandma touched the beads and she quoted a prayer, Tony would quote the prayer with her. And he sat there really watching what she did. And because he longed to know God, Tony never missed going to Mass at church on Sunday. And he actually became extremely faithful to Mass. He really tried to start to behave, and people noticed a difference in him. But he still felt that something was missing. And one day he was at church and he asked someone, he said, how can I know that I'm going to heaven when I die? And you know what the grown-up told him? The grown-up in church told him, he said, just be careful. Make sure that you say special prayers every morning. Say special prayers every evening. Don't miss a morning and don't miss an evening for 7 years. And then you'll go to heaven when you die. That's what an adult at his church told him. Okay, so for 7 years, some of you are 7 years old. That's a lot of years. For 7 years, you have to say your prayers every morning and every evening, and you can't miss one day, or you won't go to heaven. And Tony walked home determined that day that he was never going to miss a prayer in one morning or one evening for 7 whole years. Well, Tony, he'd work so hard and play so hard, and at the end of the day, he'd lay in bed and he'd start to say his prayers. And the next thing he knew, he'd wake up. He didn't get to finish his prayers. He kept messing up. And then that morning he'd say, oh no, I didn't say my prayer all the way. So you know what he'd do that morning? He was so scared that if he died, he would not go to heaven. So that morning he would say the prayer 7 times to try to make up for the one he missed. And no matter who he spoke with, no one could answer a lot of the questions he had. Is this enough? Am I doing enough to go to heaven? Well, when Tony was 14 years old, his mother had another baby. Her name was Teresa. And even though there were already so many children in the Rossi family, they did not mind having one more. Tony thought that Teresa looked just like his mom. He loved his mom. He would sit and think sometimes about how hard his mom worked. She would clean all day and cook all day. Any special holiday, she made it special for them. She would sew all the socks that he had holes in from running around outside, and she'd sew patches on his knees of his pants, and she just worked so hard. And sometimes he'd go to bed and he'd hear her up working till late hours of the night. And when Tony was 15 years old, his mom ended up getting sick. She came down with cancer. And one day, the day that she died, Tony truly thought he would never smile again. He was so sad. His mom was gone. It was like the glue that held the family together was gone. He said it almost seemed like someone turned a light out in their house. And it just felt so dark without Mom there. And he kept thinking about his mom, and he said, Mom worked so hard. She was always taking care of needy people. She couldn't go to church. He thought, man, I wish I could have died instead of my mom. Then he thought, if only I could know God, maybe I could truly understand about death. Well, Tony became restless, and he started to get stir crazy in the island he lived on. He was ready to just go on adventures. And he had an uncle visit from America, and his uncle shared with him all kinds of stories about America. And he explained some of the things they had in America that they didn't have where he lived. And he explained how in America you could make so much more money than in Italy where he lived. And Tony asked him so many questions. And then one day he decided, you know what? I will one day go to America. Even if I have to swim across the Atlantic Ocean by myself, I am gonna go one day. So to make his dream come true, Tony knew he had to get a job. You can't get to America without money, and Tony did not have money. So he got a job working as a trolley conductor. And he worked real hard to save his money. And when he turned 17, Tony realized that his dream of going to America would have to be on hold for a while, because at that time, boys and girls, World War I had started and it was raging throughout most of Europe, and he knew that he had to join it. So he decided to join the military and go fight in World War I. So on Tony's last day as a trolley driver, before he went away to go fight in the war, he did something very characteristic of him. So when you drive the trolley, you have guidelines you have to follow. You can only drive this fast. You can only do certain things. And you know what Tony decided to do? He decided to go on a crazy ride, and he drove the trolley so fast and so far, and people were so scared riding the trolley, and they were grabbing the seats terrified. And he did exactly what this little rascal, he definitely still had rascal in him, and he did that on his very last day. Well, Tony went away to war, and he fought for 3 years. He served, and without any opportunity to visit his family. He for those whole 3 years, he never saw any of his family. And then one day, Tony was walking, and he stepped on a rusty nail, and it hurt his foot so bad. He said, "Ow!" And he probably put a Band-Aid on it and tried to just keep going on serving. And one morning, he just couldn't ignore the pain anymore. He pulled off his sock and he looked at his foot. His foot was red and swollen and throbbing, and there was a streak of red going all the way up his leg. So he went to the Army medical doctor, and they took one look at his foot, and right away they said, "Oh, you have blood poisoning," which back then, boys and girls, a lot of times was a death sentence. You just couldn't get better from that. So that was really serious. Tony was put in the hospital where doctors could look after him. He had a raging fever. They didn't know if he would make it. But by God's grace, one day Tony started getting better, and he healed from the infection. Well, even though he was healed, he wasn't 100% better. And they told Tony that he had to stay in the hospital for a whole month. Again, when you're staying in a hospital, if you've ever had to stay in a hospital, you don't get to walk around and play, and no, you have to stay in bed. So it's like he was grounded all over again. So here's Tony stuck in a hospital bed. And he thought, what am I going to do for a solid month in this bed? He said, I will go crazy. So he thought about what he could do. And finally, he thought, astronomy. I've always wanted to learn about the stars. So he went to a hospital and he said, ma'am, could you please get me a book on astronomy? And she did. So Tony spent hours reading his book and studying the book. And do you know what studying astronomy did for Tony? It really pointed out to him how amazing God was, how wonderful he was. He kept saying, someday, perhaps I will get to know him. Well, he was released from the hospital and finished out his stay in the Army. And then he was released from the Army and free to go home. But at this point, nothing at home was the same. His mom had already died. One of the uncles that lived with him died. His grandma Rossi had died. And he had several brothers who had moved away from home. All that happened in the time he was in the Army. So he thought, I don't really want to go back home. So he decided he was going to go to America. So he says, all right, I will go to America. So he went, but office he visited to try to buy a ticket on a ship to America told him the same thing. Our ships are booked for months. There is no room. Everywhere he went, they told him the same thing. We're booked out for months. There's no room for you. Oh, I will find a way to America, Tony exclaimed. And that's where we're going to leave off for today. Next week, boys and girls, we'll find out how Tony gets to America. It's very exciting. And the things God does with Tony's life, this little rascal, it's amazing. And I'm so excited for us to finish up these next couple weeks so you can find out what happens. So make sure you answer the questions. Email them to Pastor Mike by Saturday. And we'll do another drawing next week. Okay, I hope that you guys are all staying healthy and know that Pastor Mike and I miss you guys so much.